My name is Nora Callahan. I'm 34 years old, and I want to start by saying that I know how this sounds. I know that when you tell people your cat saved your life, not by pulling you from a burning building, not by some dramatic act that ends up on the local news, but by refusing to leave a room, people smile politely and then look at you like you're the kind of person who talks to houseplants. I get it. But I'm going to tell you what happened anyway, because some stories deserve to be told even when they're hard to explain, even when the truth sounds stranger than anything you could make up, and because for a long time, I stayed quiet. For a long time, I convinced myself that staying quiet was the dignified thing to do, that eventually people would see what had happened, that the truth would surface on its own without me having to stand in the middle of it, waving my arms. It doesn't work that way. Before I go any further, if you've ever loved someone and felt completely betrayed by them, subscribe to Pet Witness. The stories we share here are real, they're painful, and they matter. Now let me tell you about the house on Birchwood Lane, and about miso, and about everything my parents took from me while I was sitting 2 states away, thinking we were finally okay. I grew up in Harlan Falls, Ohio. It's a small town, the kind of place where everyone knows which car belongs in which driveway, where the Methodist Church bake sale still gets a full-page spread in the local paper, where the big Friday night event is high school football from late August through November, and then absolutely nothing until the following August. Population of just under 6,000, one main street called Maple Ridge, a diner called Patty's that smells like coffee and fryer grease, and something that should have been cleaned behind the counter sometime around 2009, but never quite was. I loved it there once. I genuinely did. My parents are Gerald and Dottie Callahan. My dad spent 31 years working at the Meridian Tool and Die Plant on Route 9. My mom worked part-time for most of my childhood, doing bookkeeping for 3 or 4 small local businesses, a flooring company, a dentist's office, eventually a real estate agency called Coburn Realty. That last one is important. I'll come back to it. I have one sibling, my brother Derek. He's 4 years older than me. He lives in Harlan Falls still, has for his whole life. He married his high school girlfriend, Tammy. They have 2 kids, a boy named Colt, who's 11 now, and a girl named Bryn, who just turned 8. And they live on Fernwood Street, which is exactly 7 minutes from my parents' house. 7 minutes. My parents timed it once and mentioned it proudly at Thanksgiving like it was an achievement Derek had earned, like proximity to them was something you put on a trophy. I want to be careful here, because I've been in therapy long enough to know that the easy version of this story makes Derek and Tammy the villains and leaves it there. And the truth is more complicated than that. The truth usually is, but I also want to be honest about what I saw, what I felt, and what eventually happened, because the full picture matters. For most of our childhood, Derek was the easy one, and I was the difficult one. Not in any extreme way, nothing that would register on the outside. But in our house, Derek was the one who stayed. He was the one who showed up. He came home for Sunday dinners and watched the game with Dad, and helped Mom haul groceries in from the car without being asked. He was present in a way that my parents read as loyalty. I left for college at 18. Ohio State, on a partial academic scholarship and a pile of student loans I'm still paying off. Studied communications, graduated in 4 years. Moved to Columbus after graduation for a job at a mid-size marketing firm called Beacon Group, where I made $38,000 a year starting, which felt like an enormous amount of money for about 3 weeks until I realized what Columbus rent was. I visited home for holidays. I called my mom every Sunday, usually from the parking lot of a grocery store or while I was folding laundry, because those were the 2 moments in my week where my hands were occupied, but my mind wasn't. I sent birthday cards. I drove back from my grandmother's funeral in March of 2017. I was present in the ways I could be, but I was not 7 minutes away. And in my family, that mattered more than I understood for a very long time. In 2018, I got a promotion at Beacon Group, title changed to Senior Communication Strategist, salary jumped to $61,000, which was a real number for me at that point in my life. It meant I could finally stop feeling the low-grade financial anxiety that had been living in my chest since graduation. It meant I could start saving in a way that felt real, not just putting $30 here and $40 there into a savings account and watching it grow like a plant that didn't really want to survive. I also met someone that year. His name was Paul. He was kind and funny and genuinely good with people in a way that I still admired, even after we eventually stopped working. We dated for 2 years. He had a dog, a big, dopey golden retriever named Biscuit, who loved everyone and everything with zero discrimination. And I, for the first time, understood what it felt like to have an animal in your daily life. To have something living that was always just genuinely happy to see you. That's when I started thinking about getting a cat. I got Miso in September of 2019. She was 8 weeks old. I drove 40 minutes to a shelter in Westerville and sat in a room with 6 kittens, and she was the only one who walked directly to me and sat down on my foot like she had already decided and was just waiting for me to catch up. She was a small calico, orange and black and white, with one slightly bent ear that had never quite straightened out from kittenhood, and enormous green eyes that always looked like she was in the middle of figuring something out. I named her Miso because the first morning I brought her home, she knocked over a pot on my stove while I was making soup and looked at me afterward with absolutely zero remorse. It felt like a name she had earned. I don't know how to explain the bond I had with Miso without sounding like every person who has ever loved a pet sounds when they try to explain it to someone who hasn't, but I'll try. Miso was not a casual presence in my life. She was my first real understanding of unconditional attention. Not unconditional love exactly. Miso had opinions and expressed them. She would turn her back on me if I came home too late. She would push objects off my nightstand if I stayed on my phone too long at night. She had a very specific way of sitting directly in front of my face when she felt I needed to pay attention to something. She communicated constantly. She had a whole vocabulary of sounds and positions and expressions that I learned over months and years, the way you learn a second language. Slowly, imperfectly, and then suddenly, fluently. She slept on the left side of my pillow every single night for 5 years. Okay. I need to back up a little because I've gotten ahead of myself and I want you to understand the full timeline before I get to the part about the house. In early 2020, my father had a health scare. It turned out to be manageable. Elevated blood pressure, some cardiac stress that the doctors got under control with medication, and a few lifestyle adjustments. But for about 6 weeks, it felt serious enough that I drove home 3 times and made plans in my head for how I would handle things if something happened. And in that period, something shifted in my relationship with my parents, particularly with my mom. She called more, and not the usual Sunday calls where we covered the weather and Derek's kids and whether Patty's had changed their pie recipe. She called on Tuesdays, Thursdays, sometimes twice in a weekend. She told me she missed me. She said she wished I lived closer. She said, and I remember exactly where I was when she said this, sitting at my kitchen table eating cereal at 7:15 on a Wednesday morning. She said, "Nora, when something like this happens, you realize the only thing that matters is family being close." I believed her. I want you to understand that. I believed her completely. In the fall of 2020, I ended things with Paul. It was mutual and sad and civil in the way endings are when both people know it's right, but neither of them really wants to be the one to say it first. He moved to Pittsburgh for a new job. I stayed in Columbus. I had miso. I had my apartment on Clement Avenue. I had my work. And I had, growing quietly in the back of my mind, an idea. What if I moved back to Harlan Falls? Not permanently, or maybe permanently. I wasn't sure. My job had been fully remote since March of 2020. Like most things, I could work from anywhere. Columbus rent was not getting cheaper. My father's health, while stable, had put the reality of my parents' age in front of me in a way I couldn't ignore anymore. I was 31, alone, and I missed the particular quality of quiet that small towns have after 10 o'clock at night, when the whole street goes dark and you can actually hear yourself think. I visited home in November of 2020 for Thanksgiving. It was a small gathering, just us because of COVID restrictions. And on the second evening, I sat down with my parents at the kitchen table, and I told them I was thinking about coming back. My mother cried. Actual tears. She held my hand across the table and said, "Nora, that would mean everything to us." My father nodded slowly in his chair, the way he did when something mattered to him, and he didn't quite have the words for it. Derek was quiet. He was sitting on the other side of the table eating a piece of leftover pie, and when I looked over at him, he smiled at me, with his mouth, but not really with anything else. I noticed it. I filed it away and told myself I was being paranoid. I went back to Columbus and started researching the Harlan Falls housing market, which was small, obviously, because the whole town was small, but there were options. Modest houses in the $140,000 to $180,000 range. One on Birchwood Lane caught my attention almost immediately. It was a 2-bedroom, 1-bath house, built in 1962, about 1,100 square feet, covered front porch, small fenced backyard, hardwood floors under carpet according to the listing. The asking price was $158,000. It had been sitting on the market for several months, which in a small town usually means something is wrong with the inspection or the neighbors are a problem. But when I had a local inspector look at it, I paid him $375 for a full report. It came back essentially clean. The furnace was old but functional. The roof had maybe 6 years left on it. The electrical had been updated sometime in the 90s. Nothing that scared me. The seller was an older man named Russell Heim who had lived there for 27 years and was moving to Scottsdale to be near his daughter. He was motivated. We negotiated. I put in an offer at $147,500. He countered at $153,000. We settled at $151,250. I put 20% down, just over $30,000. That was my savings from 3 years of disciplined, somewhat joyless budgeting, wiped out in a wire transfer on a Tuesday morning in January 2021. My mortgage was $840 a month. I had calculated this out to the point where it felt safe, where it felt like something I could genuinely do. I moved to Harlan Falls in February 2021. The moving truck came on a Friday. It was 17 degrees, and the driveway was iced over, and I slipped carrying a box of kitchen things and sat on the ground for a moment just breathing the cold air and looking up at the pale gray sky and thinking, okay, this is real now. Miso made the drive in her carrier on the passenger seat. She yowled for the first 40 minutes and then fell completely silent, the way she did when she had protested enough and was ready to simply endure. When I opened her carrier in the empty living room of the house on Birchwood Lane, she walked out slowly, sniffed the baseboard by the front door, walked the entire perimeter of the room, and then sat down in the exact center of the floor and looked at me, like she was waiting to see what I was going to do next. "This is home now," I told her. She blinked once, slowly. Within 3 weeks, I had painted the second bedroom a soft gray green, built a cat shelf on the wall by the window in the living room. 5 hours, 2 YouTube tutorials, and several colorful words, and started to feel something I hadn't felt in years, something I can only describe as settled. My parents came over for dinner on a Saturday in March. I made pasta and garlic bread and a salad that was slightly underdressed because I misjudged the lemon. My mom walked through the rooms with her hands clasped in front of her and said things like, "Oh, this is charming," and "You've done so much already," with genuine warmth. My dad sat at my kitchen table and drank coffee from the mug I'd set out for him, a plain white one with a small blue rim. Nothing special, but he wrapped both his hands around it the way he always did with a hot drink, like he was holding something he wanted to keep. Derek and Tammy came by later that same evening with Colt and Bryn. Colt wanted to pet Miso, who tolerated exactly 1 stroke behind the ear before relocating to the top of the refrigerator. Bryn asked me if she could have the gray bedroom, and I laughed and said not right now. Tammy looked around the house with an expression I can only describe as measuring. Not hostile, not unfriendly, just calculating, like she was running numbers. I noticed it the way you notice a sound that isn't quite right in a room, not loudly but persistently. Derek hugged me at the door when they left. He held on a beat longer than usual. "I'm glad you're home, Nora," he said. I believed him. If you're finding this story difficult to listen to already, I want to tell you it gets harder before it gets better. And I want to thank you for being here. Subscribe to Pet Witness if you haven't yet. We share stories that deserve to be heard, and this is one of them. Now, the first year on Birchwood Lane was genuinely good. I am not going to skip past that because it matters. It was real and it was good, and the fact that it was good made everything that came after harder to make sense of. If things had been bad from the beginning, maybe I would have seen it coming, but they weren't. I had Sunday dinners at my parents' house most weeks. My mom would make pot roast or baked chicken, the kind of meal that requires 3 hours of preparation and fills the whole house with a smell you can't replicate no matter how many times you try to recreate it in your own kitchen. My dad and I would watch whatever game was on. He's a Browns fan, which tells you something about his relationship with disappointment. And I'd sit on the arm of the couch the way I had as a kid, with my feet tucked under me. I made friends. Slowly. The way you do in a small town when you've been gone long enough that people remember you but don't quite know you anymore. A woman named Carla, who managed the Harlan Falls Public Library, became a genuine friend. We went to Patty's on Thursday mornings when we both happened to be free and drank mediocre coffee and talked about books and work and the specific, particular exhaustion of being a woman in your early 30s. She's still my friend. She's one of the people who got me through what came later. Miso settled into Birchwood Lane like she had always belonged there. She claimed the living room window as her station, spent hours watching the yard, developed strong opinions about the squirrels. She had a specific spot on the couch that she returned to every evening, the right corner where the cushion was slightly more compressed than the others, and she would be there without fail when I sat down after dinner, not always touching me, but always close, always oriented toward me in a way that I found quietly comforting in a manner that's difficult to put into words. She started spending time in the second bedroom, which I was using as a home office. She'd sit on the windowsill while I worked, sometimes on the desk next to my laptop, which was a challenge when she decided to walk across the keyboard at critical moments. But there was a particular afternoon in September of 2021. I remember it clearly because I'd had a frustrating day with a difficult client, and I was sitting at my desk feeling the particular defeated feeling of having worked hard at something that felt pointless. And Miso climbed into my lap and just sat there, not doing anything, just sitting there, warm and heavy and present, and the feelings started to loosen. I started crying a little, just a few tears, the kind that come out when you've been holding something in and your guard comes down unexpectedly. Miso stayed in my lap for 45 minutes. Didn't move, just stayed. Okay? I'm going to tell you about the first strange thing that happened. It was October 2021. I came back from a long weekend in Columbus visiting old coworkers and walked through my front door on a Sunday evening to find that something had been moved. My house had that particular feeling that spaces have when someone else has been in them. A subtle shift in the air, something slightly wrong about where things were. A kitchen chair was at a different angle than I left it. The back door, which I always left unlocked when I was gone, because the lock was sticky and I was worried about not being able to get in during an emergency, which I realize now was a mistake, had been relocked from the inside somehow. Miso was sitting in the middle of the kitchen floor when I came in, completely still, watching the back hallway. I told myself I was imagining things. But later that night, I found a coffee mug in the drying rack that wasn't mine. A plain blue ceramic mug, heavier than my mugs, not something I owned. I stood in my kitchen holding it for a while, turning it over in my hands. I looked for initials or a chip or anything identifying. Nothing. I texted my mom. "Did you stop by while I was gone?" She replied 4 minutes later. "No, why? Everything okay?" I said, "Yes, everything's fine," and put the mug in a cabinet and mostly forgot about it. Miso watched the back hallway for 3 days. The second strange thing happened in December. My parents asked me during a Sunday dinner whether I had thought about refinancing the house. I said I hadn't, really. I'd only been in it about 10 months. The rate I'd gotten was fine. My dad mentioned that housing prices had gone up significantly in the area since I'd bought. Which was true. Even in Harlan Falls, the market had moved. My mom mentioned that Coburn Realty, the agency she'd done bookkeeping for years ago, had been doing a lot of business. I didn't think anything of it. People make conversation. Then Derek, who had been eating quietly, said, "You know, if you ever decided to sell, you'd make a nice profit." It was a casual sentence. It was said while he was cutting a piece of bread. He didn't look up when he said it. I said something like, "I just got here, Derek." And everyone laughed, and it passed. But it sat in me somewhere. The third thing, and this is where it starts to get harder to excuse, happened in late January 2022. I was coming out of the post office on Maple Ridge when I ran into Beverly Coburn, who ran Coburn Realty, which occupied a small office between the insurance agency and what used to be a gift shop and was now a cell phone store. Beverly was maybe 65, thin, with very white hair she kept in a bun so tight it looked structural. She'd known my parents for years, specifically my mother, who had done their bookkeeping on and off for nearly a decade. She smiled at me and said, "Nora, it's so nice to see you settling in." I said, "Thank you." She said, "Your mother was telling me the Birchwood place is just lovely now." I smiled, said I was proud of it. She said, "Of course, the market is really something right now. You could do very well if you ever wanted to." Very well. I said something vague and polite and walked to my car, and I sat there in the parking lot for a moment, in the cold, with the car running, thinking about my mother talking to Beverly Coburn about my house, which my mother had never mentioned to me. I drove home. I made tea. I sat on the couch and Miso came and lay across my legs, and I stroked her ears, and I thought, "You're being paranoid. Your mom knows Beverly. They ran into each other. People talk." I convinced myself of that. I'm going to pause here and tell you something, and I want you to really hear it, because it's the part of this kind of story that people always underestimate, the part that everyone, including me, gets wrong. The danger wasn't that my parents were obviously terrible. The danger was that they were mostly good, mostly loving, mostly warm people who had one enormous blind spot and one enormous need. And those two things, combined with someone else's idea, someone else's influence, created something that they convinced themselves was reasonable. That's the part that took me the longest to understand, and that's also the part that took me the longest to forgive. Spring of 2022. I had been in the house 14 months. I had painted the porch a deep charcoal gray. I had pulled up the carpet in the second bedroom myself. 7 hours, a crowbar, a lot of staple pulling, and found the hardwood the listing had promised. I had planted a small garden in the backyard, mostly herbs, nothing ambitious, but it was mine. I had put a wooden cat door between the office and the hallway so Miso could come and go as she pleased. I was settled. My mortgage payment was still 840 feathers. I had rebuilt a portion of my savings, not back to what it was, but enough that I didn't feel the low-grade financial fear anymore. My salary had gone up again with a cost of living adjustment to $67,500. I was doing well, not extravagantly well, but steadily, solidly well. In April, my parents came for dinner, and my mother asked me, while I was at the stove, if I would consider adding them to my home's deed. I turned around. She was sitting at my kitchen table looking at me with a very even, very practiced expression. My dad was next to her, looking at his hands. She said it was just something some families did. She said it would simplify things down the road. She said that, in case anything happened, And here she reached over and touched my dad's arm. It would just make things easier for everyone. I felt something cold move through me. I said, "Mom, I don't think I want to do that." She said, "Okay." She said she just wanted to mention it. She smiled and asked me how the pasta was coming. We didn't talk about it again that night. 2 weeks later, Derek called me. He called on a Tuesday, which was unusual. Derek and I texted mostly. Short, practical messages about logistics or family events. A phone call from Derek on a Tuesday afternoon felt significant in a way I couldn't quite name. He asked me how I was. We talked for a few minutes about normal things. Then he said, "Mom mentioned she talked to you about the deed thing." I said yes. He said, "I think it's a good idea, Nora. I know it sounds weird, but it would really give them peace of mind." I said, "Derek, it's my house. I bought it. I pay the mortgage every month. I don't see why their names need to be on it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know how much it would mean to them." I said I would think about it. I didn't think about it. Or I did think about it, and what I thought was, no, not in a hostile way, just no. It didn't make sense. Adding your parents to the deed of a home you purchased with your own money and your own savings and your own credit is not a normal thing to do. I know some families do it. I understand the logic in certain situations. But this was not that situation. This was my house. I had worked for it. It was mine. I let it go. And for a few months, nothing happened. Summer came. I grew tomatoes in the backyard badly, but they existed and I ate them. Miso discovered the garden and decided the herb section was a personal offense and knocked over my rosemary twice. Carla and I went to a one-day literary festival in Columbus in July and laughed at bad poetry on the drive back. I had a few quiet dates with a man named Marcus from the neighboring town of Delwood. Nothing serious, but warm and pleasant and good for me in a low-stakes way. It felt like normal life. I want you to understand that. It felt like completely normal life. The first sign that something was genuinely, seriously wrong came in October 2022. I was at Patty's on a Thursday morning with Carla when a woman sat down at the booth across from us. Her name was Greta Lindholm. She worked at the county tax office. And she gave me a look. Not a hostile look, an uncertain look. Like she had a piece of information she wasn't sure she was supposed to have. She said after a moment, "Nora, can I ask you something?" I said, "Of course." She said, "Are you planning to sell your house on Birchwood?" I said, "No. Why?" She picked up her coffee cup and looked at it for a second. Then she said, "Someone at Coburn Realty has been asking about the property, running comps. I assumed you knew about it." The table got very quiet. Carla looked at me. I looked at Greta. "When?" I said. "A few weeks ago, maybe 6 weeks." I noticed because Beverly pulled the full property history on it, which usually means a listing is being prepared. I drove home from Patty's that morning with both hands on the wheel and my mind in a very still, very cold place. I sat in my driveway for several minutes. Miso was in the living room window watching me. She always watched me when I came home. I went inside. I made coffee. I sat down at my kitchen table and I opened my laptop and I looked up the Portage County property records online. The deed for 14 Birchwood Lane, Harlan Falls, Ohio. I was still the sole owner. Nothing had changed. But the search history of that record, the number of recent lookups, was higher than it should have been for a property that wasn't listed and wasn't in any visible transaction. Someone had been looking at it multiple times. I called my mother. She answered on the second ring. I said, "Mom, I heard Coburn Realty has been pulling records on my house." There was a pause, a very specific kind of pause, the kind that is actually a calculation disguised as hesitation. She said, "Where did you hear that?" Not, "That's not true." Not, "What are you talking about?" "Where did you hear that?" I said. "Is there something going on that I need to know about?" She said, "Nora, we are just trying to look out for you. You could make real money right now if you sold that house." "The market?" I said, "Mom, it's my house. I'm not selling it." She said, Of course. We were just exploring the idea. We didn't mean anything by it." I hung up feeling something I could not name precisely. Not quite anger, not quite betrayal, but something in the region of both, like standing at the edge of something and not being sure yet how far the drop was. Miso came and sat next to me on the couch. She looked at my face for a moment with those enormous green eyes and then tucked her paws under her chest and settled in beside me. I told myself it was okay. I told myself it was just my parents being over-involved, being over-eager, meaning well in a clumsy way. I told myself I had handled it. I had not handled it. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known at that point, was that the conversation about putting my parents' names on the deed was not a spontaneous idea my mother had come up with at my kitchen table. It had been planned. It had been planned months before she ever said the words to me, and it had not been her idea. January 2023, a year and almost 2 months after I'd bought the house. Cold. A particular kind of Ohio cold that gets into the walls of older houses and settles there. I was sleeping under 2 blankets. Miso was on the left side of my pillow, as always. I came home from a work call on a Wednesday afternoon. I'd driven to the library to use the conference room because my internet had been unstable, and walked through my front door to find an envelope on my kitchen table. My front door had been locked. I had locked it. I was certain of that. The envelope was plain white. My name was written on it in my mother's handwriting. I stood there for a moment, coat still on, keys in my hand. Inside the envelope was a printed document, several pages. At the top of the first page, it said, "Purchase and Sale Agreement." Below that, the address, 14 Birchwood Lane, Harlan Falls, Ohio. Below that, a list of the parties involved. Seller, Gerald M. Callahan and Dorothy A. Callahan. I read it twice. I read it a third time. My parents as sellers of my house. There was a handwritten note tucked behind the last page. My mother's handwriting. It said, "Nora, we know this is a lot to take in. We want to talk. Please don't do anything until we talk. We love you." I sat down on the kitchen floor. I don't know how long I sat there. It was dark by the time I was aware of the room again. Miso was sitting directly in front of me, 6 inches from my face, completely still, watching me with that focused, intense expression she had, the one that wasn't curiosity and wasn't alarm but was something between the two, the one that meant she had assessed the situation and decided I needed her close. I reached out and put my hand on her. She stayed. I don't know what I would have done in that moment if she hadn't been there. I know that sounds like a dramatic thing to say, but the honest truth is that having something warm and real and solid under my hand in that moment was the thing that kept me from completely unraveling. I need to pause for a second, because I know this is a lot to sit with. If you're listening to this and you've ever had someone close to you violate your trust in a way that made you question everything, if you've ever sat on a floor somewhere feeling like the ground has gone out from under you, leave a comment below. You are not alone. And please subscribe to Pet Witness. Stories like this deserve a community around them. Let me explain what had happened. Because a forged deed is not simple. You can't just write your name on someone else's property record and have it hold up. What my parents had done, what they had actually done, was more sophisticated than that, and it had taken longer to put together than I had realized. Here is what I eventually found out piece by piece over the following weeks. Some of it came from Carla, who started digging the moment I called her. Some of it came from a property attorney in Columbus named David Kwan, who I hired for a $3,500 retainer that I absolutely did not have, and charged to a credit card, without a second of hesitation. Some of it came from Greta Lindholm at the tax office, who, bless her, had been watching this situation with growing unease for months and was ready to tell me everything she knew. In August of 2022, my parents had added their names to the deed of my house, not through forgery, through a document called a quitclaim deed, a real, legally filed document that had been signed and notarized and recorded with the county recorder's office. A quitclaim deed transfers ownership interests in a property. It can be used legitimately in many situations. It can also be used like a skeleton key if someone knows how to work the system. The question David Kwan immediately asked was, how had my signature appeared on that document? Because I had never signed anything. The answer, which came out slowly and then all at once, was that my signature had been forged. The notary who had certified the document was a woman named Paula Greff. Paula Greff was Beverly Coburn's sister-in-law, Beverly Coburn, Coburn Realty. The woman my mother had done bookkeeping for. The woman who had pulled property comps on my house 6 weeks before Greta Lindholm noticed it. The woman who stood to collect a listing commission on the sale of 14 Birchwood Lane, Harlan Falls, Ohio. The purchase and sale agreement I found on my kitchen table that January afternoon was a real offer, a real buyer, a cash offer of $219,000 for a house I had paid $151,250 for less than 2 years earlier. My parents were listed as the sellers. The closing date was set for March 15, 2023, less than 8 weeks away. I stayed up until 3 in the morning the night I found out. Carla drove over and sat with me at my kitchen table until after midnight. We drank tea and went over the documents, and she kept her hand on my arm in that particular way she had that meant she understood without needing to say it. Miso moved between us through the night, from my lap to the table to Carla's lap and back, as if she was checking on the situation from multiple angles. Around 11, Carla said quietly, "Nora, you need a lawyer." I said I knew. She said, "You need one today, or as close to today as possible." I said, "Carla, how did they get into my house to leave that envelope?" She was quiet. "I think," she said slowly, "someone had a key." That mystery blue mug was in my cabinet. I'd never thrown it out. The next morning, I called David Kwan's office. His assistant got me a call with him that afternoon. I sat in my home office, at the desk where Miso sat next to me every day while I worked, and I told him everything I've told you, but in the compressed, factual, slightly numb way you tell a lawyer things when you're trying not to cry. He listened. He asked specific questions. Date of purchase, purchase price, date the quitclaim was filed, names of all parties on the new deed, name of the notary. When I gave him Paula Greff's name, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Okay, this is serious, but I want you to hear me clearly. This is recoverable. A fraudulent quitclaim deed is a criminal matter, not just a civil one. We are going to move fast and we are going to document everything. Can you stay in the house?" I said I wasn't going anywhere. He said, "Good, don't leave that house. Change your locks today. Today, not tomorrow." I called a locksmith within the hour. By 4:30 that afternoon, I had 3 new deadbolts. The locksmith, a man named Phil who had a son in Colt's class, looked at the back door lock and said, "Someone's worked this before, see that?" He showed me a small series of scratches around the keyhole, consistent with picking. He charged me $280 and I paid it without flinching. I texted my mother that evening, one sentence, "I know what you did. I have a lawyer." She did not respond. My father called me 20 minutes later. He was crying. I had heard my father cry exactly twice in my life. At his mother's funeral when I was 9, and now his voice was broken in a way that hit me somewhere deep and old and complicated, the place where your parents' pain still has authority over you no matter what they've done. He said, "Nora, please let us explain." I said, "Dad, my lawyer has told me not to speak with you about this. I'm going to respect that." He said, "We weren't going to keep the money. You have to know that." I said, "Dad, please don't." He said, "Derek," and then stopped. There was a pause. "Derek what?" I said. But my father had already decided he wasn't going to finish that sentence, and he said he was sorry, and he hung up. Derek. I sat with that for a long time. Let me tell you what Derek had done. It took several weeks and David Kwan's considerable skill at document discovery to piece it together. But here is what happened. Derek had been the architect of this, not my parents, or not entirely my parents. Derek had gone to them with the idea. He had done the math, looked at what my house was worth versus what I had paid for it, looked at the market, looked at what a cash buyer would offer. And he had presented it to my parents as a solution to something. What solution? Here's the part that genuinely shocked me more than anything else. My parents were in financial trouble, real trouble. Not desperation, but serious, escalating trouble. My father's medical bills from his 2020 cardiac event had never been fully resolved. There was a balance of just over $34,000 that had been partially covered by insurance, and the rest was sitting in collections. The house on Carver Street where they'd lived for 30 years was paid off, but the property taxes had gone up and my mother had miscalculated, or perhaps avoided calculating, their fixed retirement income against their actual monthly costs, and they were spending more than they were receiving, not dramatically, but steadily, a slow drain. Derek knew this. He had known it for over a year. He had not told me. He had instead proposed a plan: sell Nora's house, split the profit with Mom and Dad after paying off their debt, present it to them as a loan they would repay, tell Nora afterward, after the closing, once the money was in hand, and position it as something that had been done for the family. For the family. The thing about Derek's plan that I have spent 2 years in therapy trying to fully understand is this. I don't think he saw himself as a villain. I think he saw himself as practical. I think he looked at the situation. Parents in debt, sister with equity, market at a peak. And he did the math the way he always did everything. With efficiency and without asking anyone who needed to be asked. He had convinced my parents that it was the right thing to do, that I would understand, that families helped each other, that I had always been the one who didn't show up, who moved away, who left them to handle things alone, that the least I could do was contribute to the solution even if I didn't know I was doing it. And my parents, who were scared and tired and in debt, and who had always trusted Derek more than their own judgment, had believed him. My mother had cried when she signed the quitclaim. My father had said nothing, just stared at the paper for a long time. I know this because it came out later in a conversation that I was not part of but was recounted to me secondhand by someone who was. That detail, my father staring at the paper, stays with me. It doesn't excuse it. I want to be clear about that. What they did was wrong. It was a crime. A real, documented, legally actionable crime. But when I think about my father sitting at a table staring at a paper he was about to sign, I think about a man who had been convinced by his son that there was no other choice. And I think about how much he must have hated himself in that moment. And then I think about the fact that he signed anyway. And then I feel something that doesn't have a clean name. In February 2023, David Kwan filed for an emergency injunction to halt the closing. It was granted. The buyer, a real estate investment company from Columbus, by the way, not an individual person, not some family who wanted a home, was notified that the sale was legally contested and could not proceed. On February 22nd, Portage County Sheriff's Department opened a criminal investigation into the forged notarization of the quitclaim deed. On March 3rd, Paula Greff, Beverly Coburn's sister-in-law, agreed to cooperate with investigators in exchange for a reduced charge. She told them everything. The quitclaim had been forged. My signature, which Paula had notarized as if she had witnessed me sign it personally, had been copied from my original mortgage closing documents, which my mother had access to because she had been present at the closing. I had invited her. I had wanted her there. She had saved a copy of my signature. I'm going to stop here for a moment because I want to acknowledge something. I know this sounds like I'm describing strangers. I know it sounds like a crime documentary about people you've never met. But these are my parents. I sat at their kitchen table every Sunday for a year eating pot roast. I watched my dad hold that white coffee mug with the blue rim in both hands. I let my mother cry when I told her I was moving home because I believed those tears were real. I believed the tears were real. I'm not sure, even now, that they weren't. I'm not sure that you can fake the kind of grief my mother showed in that moment. I think she genuinely missed me. I think she genuinely wanted me close. And I think all of that was true at the same time as everything else that happened. And that is the most painful part of this entire story. Not the legal part, not the financial part, not even the violation of my home. The most painful part is that I have to hold two truths at once. My parents loved me, and they chose their fear over that love. It took me a long time to be able to say that sentence out loud. After the investigation opened, my brother went completely silent. He stopped answering my calls. Not that I made many. He removed himself from the family group chat, which had mostly been used for logistics and birthday reminders and photos of Colt and Bryn doing things at school. Tammy sent me one text. It said, "I want you to know I had no idea about any of this." I don't know if that's true. I'm not sure it matters at this point. My parents did not contact me directly for several weeks. Not because I had told them not to. David Kwan had advised me to limit direct contact, and I was following that advice. But also, I think, because they didn't know what to say. The particular silence between us during that period felt like a third thing in the room. Not quite anger and not quite grief. Something more exhausted than either. In mid-March, through David Kwan, they acknowledged that the quitclaim deed contained a fraudulent signature. They signed a corrective deed, a legal document restoring sole ownership to me. The real estate investment company's offer was formally rejected. 14 Birchwood Lane was still mine. It took 3 weeks of legal work and several $1,000s I didn't have to get back what had never legally left. And I want you to sit with that for a second because the absurdity of it is also part of the reality. I spent money I didn't have to reclaim a house that had always been mine. This is the part of the story where most people, I think, expect the big confrontation scene. The shouted accusations, the tears and the ultimatums and the dramatic family implosion. And some of that happened, but it didn't happen the way you might expect. In April, I drove to my parents' house on Carver Street on a Sunday afternoon. I hadn't been there since before I found the envelope. I drove there alone. I left Miso at home, which she expressed displeasure about by sitting directly in the path of the front door as I tried to leave. My mother opened the door before I could knock. She had been watching for my car clearly. She looked smaller than I remembered, or not smaller, just less certain of herself. The way people look when a version of themselves they'd been carrying has been removed from them. She said, "Come in." I went in. My dad was in his chair. The game was on, muted. He looked at me when I came through the door, and for a moment his face did something complicated. Not quite relief, not quite shame, not quite either. And then he reached over and turned the TV off entirely. I sat on the couch across from him. My mother sat in the other chair. We were quiet for a moment. Then my dad said, "I'm sorry, Nora." Just that. Very simply. The way men of that generation say the most important things, without decoration, without explanation, almost as if they're afraid that adding more words will make it smaller. My mother said, "We were scared. I know that isn't enough. I know nothing I can say is enough." I said, "I know you were scared." And then I said, "I would have helped you. If you had asked me, I would have helped you." My mother looked at the floor. I said, "Why didn't you ask me?" She was quiet for a long time. She said, "Derek said you wouldn't. Derek said you'd feel put upon, that you'd help but you'd resent it, that it was better to handle it a different way." I looked at my father. He nodded. A small, miserable nod. Derek had told them I wouldn't help. He hadn't asked me. He had assumed, or more likely, he hadn't assumed. He had decided, because a decision was easier to control than a question. And he had built a scenario around that decision and brought it to 2 frightened older people who trusted him and told them there was no other way. That's the detail I've thought about the most over the years since. Not what they did to me, but what Derek told them about me, what he decided I was, without giving me the chance to be anything else. He was wrong. I would have helped. I was not a perfect person, and I had not been a perfect daughter, and I had been absent in ways that mattered. But I would have helped. I want to pause here, because this is the emotional center of this story, and I don't want to rush past it for the sake of what comes next. The legal outcomes, the consequences, those matter. But this moment in my parents' living room on a Sunday afternoon in April, with the muted TV and the sound of the neighbor's lawnmower and my mother's hands in her lap, this is the moment that changed something fundamental in me. Because I understood sitting there that my entire family had been operating on a set of assumptions about who I was that they had never tested against who I actually was. They had built a version of me, the one who left, the one who didn't show up, the one who wouldn't help, and they had made decisions based on that version without ever checking it against reality. And Derek had known that, had used it, had weaponized a story about me that existed only in our family's collective narrative, a story that I had never been given the chance to contradict. I left my parents' house that afternoon with no resolution, exactly. No clean forgiveness speech, no emotional catharsis, just a quiet, sad conversation that ended with my mother walking me to the door and standing there as I got in my car, watching me pull out of the driveway the way she had watched me leave every time I'd driven away from that house since I was 18. I drove home. The sun was setting. It was one of those early spring Ohio evenings where the light gets long and gold and everything looks more meaningful than it probably is. I unlocked the door at 14 Birchwood Lane, and Miso was sitting 4 feet from the door, waiting. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she turned and walked toward the kitchen and looked back at me once, as if to say, "Well, are you coming?" I followed her. Over the following months, the legal process moved at its own pace, which is to say, slowly. David Kwan had filed a civil complaint against Beverly Coburn and Coburn Realty in addition to the criminal investigation. The case against Paula Greff, the notary, moved faster. She had cooperated and the evidence was documentary and clean. She received a suspended license and a fine and a criminal conviction for notarial misconduct, which is a real crime in Ohio that can result in a felony charge in serious cases. Her case was treated as a serious one. Beverly Coburn's liability was more complex but also more substantial. She had facilitated the transaction, stood to benefit from the commission, and had clearly been involved in the planning stages. She had pulled the property history before any listing agreement existed, which meant she had known about the plan while it was still being developed. Her license was suspended pending investigation by the Ohio Division of Real Estate and Professional Licensing. And then something unexpected happened. In May 2023, a woman named Lorraine Mattis contacted David Kwan's office. Lorraine was 63 years old. She lived in Wellston, Ohio, a small town about an hour south of Harlan Falls. She had never met me, but she had seen a notice in a county legal filing, the kind of notice that gets published in local papers as a matter of record when certain legal proceedings are filed, and she had recognized Beverly Coburn's name, because Coburn Realty had done something very similar to Lorraine Mattis 7 years earlier. In 2016, Lorraine had inherited a property from her uncle, a small commercial building on the edge of Wellston. She had been in the process of deciding what to do with it when Coburn Realty, which had expanded its reach across the region, had introduced itself through a mutual contact. Lorraine had signed what she believed was a listing agreement. What she had actually signed, what it turned out she had actually signed with a notarized document that Beverly Coburn had prepared, was a limited power of attorney that allowed Coburn Realty to act on her behalf in property transactions. The building had been sold within 4 months. Lorraine had received a portion of the proceeds, framed as the net after fees and costs. But the actual sale price and the actual fee structure were. She eventually discovered not what she had been told. She had tried to pursue it at the time, had been told by a local attorney that her case was weak because she had, technically, signed the document, had been advised to accept the situation. She had never fully accepted the situation. And when she saw Beverly Coburn's name in a legal filing 7 years later, she called David Kwan and said, "I think this woman has done this before." She had. The investigation that followed over the next 8 months uncovered 4 additional cases in 3 different Ohio counties, in which Beverly Coburn or Coburn Realty had been involved in property transactions that involved documents signed by parties who either couldn't remember signing them or disputed the circumstances under which they had signed. 2 of the 4 involved notarized documents prepared by Paula Greff. In 2 of those cases, the property owners had received some money from the transactions. In 1, they had received almost nothing. In 1, an elderly man in his 80s named Harold Chen, whose family had tried and failed to pursue the matter before he died, the loss had been close to $90,000. Beverly Coburn had been operating a quiet, low-volume, geographically dispersed real estate fraud for at least a decade. My parents had not known this. I want to be clear about that. They had not known that they were being used as instruments in a larger criminal pattern. They had known what they were doing to me. They had not known they were not the first people Beverly Coburn had used to access a property she intended to profit from. That doesn't make what they did better, but it is part of the truth. Beverly Coburn was charged in Portage County in November 2023 with real estate fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. Lorraine Mattis's case was brought in as prior conduct evidence. The total amount involved across all identified cases was estimated at over $340,000. She pleaded not guilty. She went to trial in April 2024. I testified. I want to tell you about that day, because I think about it still. I drove to the Portage County Courthouse in Ravenna on a Tuesday morning in April. It was raining. A steady, gray, mid-April Ohio rain that made everything look like a photograph that had been left out too long. I wore a navy blazer over a white shirt. I had worn the same pair of earrings I'd worn on the day I closed on the house. Small gold studs. Nothing significant. But they'd been in my jewelry box since before I bought the house, and I wore them that day because I wanted some piece of the beginning of the story present at what I hoped would be the end of it. I sat in the witness chair, and I answered questions for about 40 minutes. David Kwan had prepared me for this, but the reality of the room, the formality of it, the way the acoustics made everything sound slightly slower and more deliberate, was something you can't fully prepare for. I answered each question as carefully and honestly as I could. I described finding the envelope on my kitchen table. I described the quitclaim document. I described what it felt like to realize that someone had forged my signature on a legal document and filed it with the county as if I had agreed to something I knew nothing about. The defense attorney asked me whether my parents had been present at the original purchase closing. I said yes. He asked whether I had invited them. I said yes. He asked whether I had signed any documents in their presence at that closing. I said yes. He let that sit for a moment. The implication clear, that the forgery had been enabled by my own invitation, by my own trust. I looked at him, and I said calmly, "Yes, I trusted my mother to be present at a significant moment in my life. That trust was used against me. I'm aware of that." He moved on. Beverly Coburn was convicted in May 2024 on 2 of the 3 charges: fraud and forgery. The conspiracy charge was dropped in a plea agreement negotiation that I did not have final say over and did not entirely agree with, but accepted. She was sentenced to 4 years in state prison with the possibility of parole after 2. She was also ordered to pay restitution. Lorraine Mattis was in the courtroom when the verdict was read. I looked at her when the jury foreman finished speaking. She was sitting very still with her hands in her lap, looking at the front of the room. After a moment, she closed her eyes. I thought about Harold Chen's family. I thought about all the people who sign things in good faith and lose something they can't get back. Paula Greff, who had cooperated with the investigation, had her notarial license permanently revoked. She also received a suspended sentence and 2 years of probation. She did not go to prison. I have complicated feelings about that. My parents were not charged. David Kwan and I had several conversations about this, whether they had criminal exposure, whether their role rose to the level of co-conspiracy. The determination was that their lack of financial sophistication, their limited role in the mechanics of the fraud, and the fact that they had cooperated fully with investigators, including providing evidence against Beverly Coburn that proved essential, placed them below the threshold for criminal charges. They paid me for my legal costs, $3,500, which matched my retainer exactly. My mother handed me a check at my kitchen table, the same kitchen table at which she had sat years before and asked me to add her name to my deed. She put the check in front of me and kept her hand over it for a moment before she let go. "It's not enough," she said. I said, "I know." She said, "I don't know how to make it right." I said, "I know that too." I'm not going to tell you that I forgave them that day. I'm not going to perform a forgiveness that isn't finished yet. What I will tell you is that my relationship with my parents now is different. Slower, more careful, with a kind of deliberate honesty between us that didn't exist before. My mother tells me things now. She calls when there's a problem instead of managing it quietly until it becomes a crisis. My father and I have had several conversations that have been more honest than anything we managed in the previous 34 years. Those conversations are hard, and they matter. My brother Derek has not spoken to me since this began. He moved to Akron in the fall of 2023. Tammy sends me photos of Colt and Bryn on their birthdays. Without comment, without context, just the photos arriving in my messages, like messages from a country I used to live in. I look at them. I think about Bryn asking me if she could have the gray bedroom. I feel something that I'm still learning to identify and carry. I'm not ready to talk to Derek yet. I may not ever be in the way we used to talk, but the anger has changed. It used to feel like a hot thing. Now it feels more like a scar. Present, noticeable when touched, but not actively hurting in the same way. My therapist, Dr. Anna Bauer, who I started seeing in March 2023 and have continued seeing twice a month since, would probably say that's progress. She's careful not to tell me how I should feel about any of this. She just asks questions and waits, and she is very good at waiting in a way that makes space for whatever is actually true. One of the things I told her in a session last fall, I kept asking myself why I went home. I kept blaming myself for going back, for thinking it would be different, for believing my mother's tears. She said, "Was wanting to be close to the people you love a mistake?" I said, "It made me vulnerable." She said, "Yes. And?" I sat with that for a while, and then I said, "And I don't think I would have been able to become the person I am now without that vulnerability." She wrote something down. "I still live in the house on Birchwood Lane. I want to be very clear about that. I am still here." I painted the living room last summer, a warm cream color that I spent 2 weeks selecting and that my mother said looked like the inside of a good bakery, which I took as a compliment. I finally fixed the furnace, which cost $2,100 and felt like an enormous adult thing to have survived. The backyard garden is better now. 2 raised beds, tomatoes again, but properly this time, zucchini, basil, one extremely ambitious attempt at watermelon that produced exactly 1 small watermelon that I ate alone on the back step on a Saturday in August with a sort of reverent pride. Carla came for dinner last week. We made pasta. I overdressed the salad this time, compensating for all the years of underdressing, and it was too lemony, but neither of us complained. I've stopped dating for a while, not because I'm close to it, but because I found that I genuinely liked my own company, my house, my routines, my quiet. I come home at the end of the day and there's something waiting for me that I trust completely. Something that has never once used my trust against me. I'm going to tell you about the room, because I realize I've told you everything else, and I haven't finished telling you about Miso and the room, which is, after all, where this story started. During the worst of the legal proceedings, the fall and winter of 2023, when the trial date was being set, and my days were organized around document requests and depositions and phone calls with David Kwan that left me sitting at my kitchen table feeling wrung out and transparent, Miso started doing something I couldn't explain. She stopped going into the back bedroom. This was the room I used as a home office, the room she had sat in every day while I worked for 2 years. The room where I'd built her a cat shelf, the room where she had sat on the windowsill in September 2021 and stayed in my lap for 45 minutes on the afternoon I cried. She stopped going in, not dramatically, not visibly upset. She would simply stop at the doorway and sit there, looking into the room and then turn and go somewhere else, to the living room, to the kitchen, to the bedroom. Every single day for several months she stopped at the doorway and would not go inside. I noticed it around week 3. I thought she was being strange about something. A smell I couldn't detect, a sound from the old house settling in a new way, some feline logic I couldn't access. I checked the room for pests. I changed the air in it. I moved furniture. I tried to understand what she knew that I didn't. She sat at the doorway and looked in, and she would not cross the threshold. But here is the thing. On the evening that I got the call from David Kwan, the call telling me that Beverly Coburn had been found guilty, that the verdict was in, that it was over, I was sitting on the couch in the living room. It was a Tuesday evening in May 2024. I hung up the phone and I sat for a while in the quiet of my own house, with the early summer light coming through the window at that long angle it gets in Ohio when the days are finally long again. I cried, not performatively, just quietly, privately, the way you do when something is really done. After a while, I heard Miso. She had gotten up from her spot on the couch. I could hear her moving through the hallway. I heard her stop the way she always stopped, at the doorway of the back bedroom. And then I heard her cross the threshold. I got up and went to the hallway, and she was inside the room, sitting on the cat shelf by the window, looking out at the backyard, the way she used to, like she had been waiting until it was safe to go back. I know there's probably a rational explanation. I know she was probably responding to something subtle, a change in my body language, a stress response she'd been reading in me for months that had finally changed. I know that animals are extraordinarily good at reading the humans they live with in ways that we can't always account for. But I also know what it looked like. It looked like she had been standing at the door to that room for 7 months, watching it, making sure. And when it was safe, when it was finally actually safe, she walked through. She's in there right now, on the shelf by the window. She knows I'm talking about her because she is looking at me with that expression she has, the one that isn't quite satisfaction and isn't quite patience, but is something between the two. The one that says, I've been here, I've been watching, I'm not going anywhere. Neither am I. I want to leave you with this, because I think it's the truest thing I know from all of this. The people who love you can still hurt you. The people who hurt you can still love you. Both of these things are real, and living inside that contradiction without turning it into something simpler than it is, without making people into only their worst moments or only their best ones. That is, I think, the actual work, the work that doesn't end, the work that looks different in year 2 than it did in year 1, and will probably look different again in year 5. I'm still doing it. Miso is still doing it with me. There is something profound I've come to believe about being loved by something that cannot explain itself, that cannot justify its choices or offer rationale or manage the perception of its affection. Miso stayed with me on the floor the night I found the envelope because that is what she does. She sat on my lap for 45 minutes on a Tuesday afternoon because that is what she does. She stood at the doorway of a room for 7 months and waited because that is what she does. And if you have an animal in your life, a cat, a dog, a bird, anything, I hope you understand what I mean when I say they are not a side detail. They are not background. They are, sometimes, the only thing keeping you tethered to the ground while everything overhead is moving. Hold on to that. If this story reached you, if any part of this felt familiar or important or just worth your time, subscribe to Pet Witness. These are real stories. They are shared by real people. And the fact that an animal is at the center of them doesn't make them smaller. It often makes them more true. Like this video if you think stories like this one deserve to be told. And if you've ever had a pet who seemed to know something before you did, who sat with you in the dark and refused to leave, I want to hear about it. Leave it in the comments below. I read them. I always read them. My name is Nora Callahan. I'm 34 years old. I live on Birchwood Lane in Harlan Falls, Ohio, and I'm not going anywhere.